Hey everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight to Flyleaf Books to support this local independent bookstore and this wonderful author. This evening we have the pleasure of hearing from DéLana R. Dameron about her book Redwood Court with Katie Mgongolwa. DéLana R. Dameron received an MFA in poetry from NYU. Her debut collection, How God Ends Us, was selected by Elizabeth Alexander for the South Carolina Poetry Book Prize. Dameron is also the founder of Sonoma Acres, an equestrian and cultural space in South Carolina. Katie Mgongolwa is a writer, educator, and mother living in Durham, North Carolina. She is a UNC grad and lifelong Tar Heel. I hope you enjoy the event. Remember, you can grab a copy of the book after at the register. Also, any signing that you didn't get done now, that'll happen later.
Thank you. Well, welcome. Thanks. I'm Katie, and I'm really excited to be here with DéLana. I actually met DéLana 21 years ago. We were just babies at UNC orientation, and just had the luck to be there together and recognize each other as kindred spirits, I think, and haven't looked back. And it's been really fun to be her friend along this journey as a writer, to see her grow as an artist and a storyteller, and to celebrate when she moved back down south, and now to see what the result of that move was on her craft, and then what has come since then. And so I'm excited to be in conversation with her tonight. We'll end with some questions if y'all have some. But in the meantime, we can kind of explore you as an artist here and your amazing book. Did you want to start off with a reading?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yep.
Hey y'all. Is this on?
Hey.
Yeah. Okay. So Redwood Court is, for me, I'll call it a collection of short stories. The press, the publisher, whatever, will say novel. In my heart, it's a collection of short stories about growing up in Columbia, South Carolina in the 90s, and all of the characters that raised a girl not unlike me. Her name is Mika Tabor, and I'm going to read a story, a selection, that really solidifies kind of the early moments of Mika's journey with her grandfather, who she called Tita, and everyone called Tita. And this is called How Do You Know Where You're Going? On his way to pick up his grands in his brown Toyota pickup truck with its covered camper, Tita hit a pothole in the road, and then he was in an Army-issue truck in the back roads of Korea, riding between the mine-pocked fields. There were two young girls walking row by row with a hoe or shovel, testing the hidden mines. Later, the crew back at the base mocked what they heard happen. A bandana over their eyes, soldiers used a broom handle to reach round the mess hall, falling in laughter at someone's surprise. Kaboom! Someone shouted from somewhere in the room. But Tita saw it happen with his own two eyes. There were two girls with hair as black as Mika's and a mule between them. Then there was only one girl. When he made it back to the base to shower and the blood-colored water pooled at his feet, several folks asked if he was okay. Had he been shot? He looked at the stained concrete and didn't answer. The foot had sailed through the air like a boomerang. Now Tita can't see a flock of geese going north without thinking about those girls that day in the zone. The worst part was he wasn't even supposed to be there. Working janitorial and mess hall in the service as a Negro meant his days was mostly filled with waiting until prep for the next meal. The period between lunch and supper saw him with much silence to fill, so he had made an excuse to go for a ride. Potatoes or rice was needed to round out the plate, and the platoon just across the way should have some extra. They had lost more men in the 40 days, but they still shipped rations for the full troop. Mosby, someone shouted from the back office as he put on his hat and fatigue jacket. Just going for some supplies, sir, Tita called back. Be back just so. He called He kept walking lest he pulled into some other menial task. "Tin hut," the voice commanded. Tita stopped and straightened his back. He snapped his arm into a right angle, his hand to forehead. He knew he didn't have to do the salute, but added it anyway, for good measure. "Sir, yes, sir." Tita loved the service, the way aspects of it ordered his steps, were regimented like the work he had to do as a young boy on the tobacco farm back home. Measured, somewhat predictable. Like agriculture, the Army gave Tita a set of practice that he could do over and over until his body moved like a machine. But when weather or the enemy entered the scene, he could rely on muscle memory and his bullet-quick reactions. But he was also understood that if he chose wrong, he could lose a whole harvest or his life. Riding the thin edge between order and chaos was often fine for him. A command could click you right back into place like a cog into its wheel. His army brothers, they used to call him to make sure everyone was right of mind. His superiors, though, if they croaked the command when there was no drill or imminent danger, it was more about power. "I said, where are you going, boy?" Asking it now in the way he had, Tita knew that by the syrupy linger of boy, how it was served for just the handful of black-skinned soldiers, that whatever was coming next could be trouble, nothing, a game, a show, or more trouble. "We need some more supplies, sir," Tita shouted, refusing to turn around and face his audience. "Rice, potatoes for dinner, kitchen towels." "You didn't notice before now, boy?" There was no need to repeat it, Tita knew. He tried a different escape route. "The convalescents need more sup so their bodies can repair, sir." "Well, I see." Tita relaxed his shoulders. It was just show. He heard the smile lift the phrase a few decibels, even if he didn't see the surgeon's face. "Yes, sir." Tita understood from the whites back home in Greensea, South Carolina, that if you remain small when they show their teeth, you can most times get out unscathed. For Tita, what meant never pulling his chest and always adding "sir" to his answers. "Well, Mosby, at ease. How do you know where you're going?" The slight timbre of care, so quick. It was a flip-floppiness, like a fresh catch tossed back on a boat deck, hook still in his lips, that made Tita dizzy. He was often prone to whiplash. Hot, cold, boy, son, soldier, nigger. He joked that if he had stayed in school instead of gone out into the farm fields and then into service, he might as well have become a head doctor, the way he had learned so early to measure the degrees of hatred one might have in their heart by the choice of words. When the temperature of the exchange shifted, Tita knew he had to defer and could soon enough be on his way. "Sir, medics going over for supplies too. I figured I would catch a ride, sir." Tita tipped his hat and kept his neck bit in supplication, but didn't turn around until the sergeant walked off. He hopped in the back of the covered truck, and it rumbled over the service road gravel. He beat his fist against the window after the truck hit the third pothole. "Say, you sure you know the way?" Tita asked, right before he looked over his shoulder at the rice paddy and saw the two girls and the donkey, and then one, and before the medic could answer, Tita had been lifted up in the camper and dropped down by the blast. Sasha and Mika climbed into the Toyota cabin almost as soon as Tita pulled into the yard. He didn't even have to honk. They were ready on the porch, ready to go. Mika bounded off the steps toward the truck, and Sasha moved slower, her older tween angst weighing her excitement to a slog. Mika, still small enough to sit in the middle, lifted her left leg over the gear shift and cradled it out of the way for the drive to Redwood Court. His truck wasn't built for 3 travelers, no matter how small, so Tita instructed Sasha to put her seatbelt on and to hold her arm across Mika. Most times, when it was just Tita and Mika, Tita would let Mika ride in the back camper. He set up for a few cushions and a carpet. Every few lights, Tita looked back to see if Mika was upright. He often had to fight the urge to see the camper transform into the back of the medic truck on the day of the blast. But every time he opened the truck rear gate, whenever they got wherever they were going, and Mika squealed, "Tita, that was so much fun," he understood more and more what the priest was trying to tell him in the recovery days after, that the future and the joy and the risk and pain are worth it if our generations experience a greater freedom than we are allotted. Sasha had swung her arm over Mika too quickly, and Tita heard the thud before Mika cried out. Tita had never grown up around girls, much less ones who squealed like nursing piglets. I, he said in the corner of the freeze on command call out was so familiar with. The girl zipped straight. How was he to fill a whole day with the two of them? Mika leaned out of Sasha's death grip. Tita, did you vote yet? Mama says she's going to do it after work, and Daddy too. We had a vote at my school today. Bill Clinton won, and my grade won. Bill Clinton won my grade, but Bush won all the other grades. Tita, did you vote? Who did you vote for? Too many questions for the start of the day. Tita couldn't vote because of that night in the pool hall. The owner called the cops on him for pulling his pistol out when, 2 tables over, someone broke the game open so loudly several balls fell to the floor and it sounded like a machine gun. He had enough to drink all right, and so his fingers slipped on the feather light trigger. Luckily, he won't face anyone in the room, so only a light bulb caught the bullet, but because he didn't have his dog tags that only worked for certain parts of town anyhow, he went straight to booking on trumped up charges, and on his record it said something about attempt to damage private property, and so went his vote. But Mika didn't need all that. Yep, I voted. Lost my sticker though. Now, let's go on an adventure, Tita said to match Mika's excitement. But the truck cabin, oldies crooned, and Tita ashed his marble out the cracked window. Mika sat forward and, as instructed, though probably taking advantage of said instructions, Sasha pushed her back against the canvas cushion. Tita put the truck in park and stopped at the stop sign and turned down the music. The girls were so quiet and breathing with such intent that, even with Tita's cracked window, fog started to climb up the windshield from the dashboard. Right or left? Tita asked. The girls looked over at him with bewilderment. Which way y'all want to go? Tita asked again, clarifying. Mika and Sasha looked left, looked right, then looked at Tita. Sasha, you go, he insisted. She surveyed her options, nothing looking like any place she had been. Left. Tita moved his hand to the gear shift. Sasha pushed it away. Right, Tita, right. She had gotten the adventure bug too, now seeing the possibilities in the way the road opened up with just one decision. Mika was entertained but didn't push her way into the game. Let Sasha play to see where all of this was even going. Tita has to know the way to where we're going, she said to Sasha. There's only one way to Redwood Court from home. On command, Tita turned right, and the girls looked on to see how far before they had to make the next decision. It would be a minute as they traveled down a winding back road with not too many houses. Tita pulled up to another stop sign and waited. One day, you'll see, Tita started. We always meet a fork in the road. He heard echoes of the medic through the glass pane, the crinkle of a Korean map unfolding, the gear shift, the wheels grinding through the gravel and sand. Tita stopped the Toyota at the next stop sign. Sasha yelled, right. Mika countered, left, Tita, left. But he didn't move the gear shift at first. He closed his eyes and filled his belly with air, then pushed the air out, imagining cigarette smoke rings shooting out of his pursed lips one by one. The girls recognized this breathing exercise and simmered down. Tita reached for the gear and the wheel and pushed forward in silence. Finally, they made it to Redwood Court, on time for lunch. Tita had a taste for iron and checked to see if Wheezy had brought any liver mush to fry up. After a morning bouncing between Korea and the present, smelling the burning flesh of the girl in the field and simultaneously entertaining his grands, what he really wanted was an ice-cold refresher from the back porch. He'd settle for the blood-rich liver over onions, though, and fix up some bologna sandwiches for the girls, then insist they all rest. Tita dreamed that he was falling out of a plane, and that woke him up. It felt like how he landed in Korea, but without a parachute this time. He gasped, opened his eyes, and Mika stared straight at him. If he had startled more, they would have headbutted, but this dream of falling through the clouds, watching the ground target get bigger and bigger, came so frequently that it was when he didn't dream a man pushed him out of the back of a cargo plane, that he knew darker visions would come in its stead. The startle was the feeling of gravity pulling him to earth with increasing velocity, was all. Tita, you were mumbling something just now. What did you see? Mika said. He always slept on his back with his glasses in his front pocket. At first, he was somewhere between plane and earth, asleep and awake, when Tita's voice had appeared in the atmosphere as bodiless character. That's what shook him out of it, a child's voice asking him, what did you see? What did you see? Tita grabbed his glasses on instinct and saw Mika through the fog. His heart rate rocked back to normal. Just an old friend, Tita said, finally answering. An old friend. Face still crinkled with concern, Mika turned to her real reason for waking him. Sasha and Wheezy left while they were asleep, and could she go outside? All the grands of Redwood Court were out in their yards. You could hear the tick, 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 tick of phone cable double Dutch games. Tita didn't know them all like Wheezy, and now that Mika was solely in his care, he hesitated letting her go out on her own, even as she had done it hundreds of times. Let's go out back, Tita offered in consolation. Been meaning to get them training wheels off in your bike anyhow. Tita felt it had been too long for Mika, at 7 years old, to be on a bike with training wheels. He had gone from being carted around in a wooden wagon through the tobacco fields to riding a two-wheeler at 4. So in many ways, he couldn't understand why she needed the extra support. But if he thought about it long, it made sense. The house where she lived on Forestwood Drive was on a hill and just 3 houses in off the road, which was Highway 1. It was what Mika's father, Major, could afford after he was discharged from the service and could only pick up work as a manager at Church's Chicken for a while. Redwood Court was zoned for better schools because most of the surrounding white neighborhoods were zoned for those schools, and they bused the students in for diversity by then. So the girls used the court address, which meant Mika and Sasha didn't go to school with all of the other kids on Forestwood Drive. Those factors, added with school friends and the street protected in the flat cul-de-sac of Redwood Court, meant that the very day the girls got bikes for Christmas, Sasha a red Speed 10 bike with brakes on handlebars, and Mika a Barbie bike with handle tassels and training wheels, they were taken straight to the court. It also meant that Mika couldn't ride often, so her time with training wheels stretched and stretched. Once she called herself trying to ride Sasha's bike despite their height difference. She knew how to hop on, but that was as far as she got. On her bike, she could backpedal and get a sturdy foundation. She was quick enough to hop off on the saddle, but didn't know where to go from there. When she backpedaled on Sasha's bike and the pedal kept going around the spin, Mika had no choice but to hop off before she and the bike ended up in the dust. Oh, if she had thought it through, it might have saved her and Tita some embarrassment. Later, she hopped off the seat and the bar caught her right there. Reggie had been in his backyard washing his Cadillac and heard Mika cry out and asked her if she was all right, just as she ran into the house, past Tita, who asked what was wrong, and into the blue bathroom to see if she had broken anything down there. When she inspected the toilet paper, there were red and pink dabbles of blood. Mika tossed them into the wastebasket next to the commode and stormed back outside, past Tita again. Looking for any clues as to why Mika was a tornado through the house, Tita searched the bathroom. When he looked into the wastebasket, he thought, oh Lord, was he to have this talk today with her? How's she already getting her first blood? Or was this something like what Rena went through early? Who hurt her? Just as he was starting to think of what to say, what to ask, Reggie called saying Mika had been playing with Sasha's bike and wanted to check in about the fall. From the window, Tita could see Sasha's back wheel disappearing into the shed. Next time they were together, Tita decided it would be time to move Mika up. Tita, I don't know how to ride 2 wheels though, Mika countered when he suggested going out back to take their training wheels off. Nobody will show me. He swatted the air. Ain't a worry, we'll get you, he said, and curled off the couch. Between clinks of the wrench against the white painted metal of the bike, Tita started. You've been mostly riding 2 wheels this one, since the trainers don't always stay on the ground nohow. He tapped the training wheels for emphasis. But I don't fall, Mika said. Tita nodded, jerked the wrench a few times, and the first training wheel knocked off and rolled a few inches across the yard. To steady, you have to use your feet. It's the feet mostly. You keep moving. You think you're going to fall. Keep moving. Pushing the pedals. Falls happen when you try to fix a fall by stopping. Don't stop. Keep moving, Tita said. Tita stood the bike up and held it for Mika to step through. He was glad no one had given her this. Riding a real bike. A thing you keep with you forever. Take with you wherever you go. If he did it right and he died tomorrow, she'd always get on a bike and remember he taught her how to move forward. Get on, don't be shy, Tita urged. He pointed the front wheel toward the house. Ride to the house, then come back to me. I'll give you a jump start. Giddy up. He always wondered what he could give the Grands. Weezy was the perfect gift giver, especially at Christmas. Major had smarts, was their daddy. Tita had more time than anyone, sure, but most often he fretted about whether it was enough, worrying they might tire of spending time with him just as he was starting to figure out how to make room in his crowded head and heart for the girls. Laid up in the convalescent hall after the blast, all he could picture was a house, that cornbread-colored woman he needed to marry, and later on kids and grands and great-grands and so on. That's what kept him moving forward towards home. When they came and when he realized how crowded his head was every day with cobwebs from the war, he thought about what he had to give. Who would love him? How would he connect with the next generations? But he found it. He didn't often remember too much from his childhood outside of walking up and down the forever rows of tobacco leaves, but he remembered the moment his father set him up on a bike and pushed him into a new experience. Confidence, balance, wind in his face. No matter how short or long their lives, Mika had this moment with him and no one else. Tita, I just pushed the pedals? Yes. Keep going. To the house. You don't want to fall. You got to keep pushing your feet and then steer, just like how you rode when you had trainers. Mika stepped through and Tita braced his body to hold the bike, her weight upright. Mika looked up from the bike saddle like she was about to be sent on a long journey into the unknown. But Tita, how will I know I won't fall? How will I know which way I'm going? Still holding the handlebar with one hand and the back of the saddle with the other, Tita started to rock the bike back and forth so Mika could feel the pedals move, learning the beginning of the balancing act, just like his father taught him. What did he say back then? When I push, you push on the pedals just like you know. He smiled. Before Mika could turn back to ask another question or stall, he gave her a push. Keep pedaling and turn the bike towards me before you hit the house, he called out. Don't stop until you're right back where you started with me. It will feel like flying, not falling. The wind in your face. Once you got this, you'll never lose it. I promise you that.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It probably surprises no one that she's an award-winning poet. That just exudes from you. But this is your first novel or short story collection.
Fiction project.
Fiction project. I love that. What motivated you or pushed you to do this story after your poetry collections? Like, why did you feel now was the right time for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the shortest answer to that is I was always writing both. Mm-hmm. And then it was just kind of order of publication. Mm-hmm. So poetry books kind of came quicker. A little longer answer is that I'm always writing most of my obsessions, which is the everyday Black Southern experience. And fiction gave me more room to explore many of the same themes folks might experience in some of my earlier poetry work. So, I just could expand on things that I have been thinking about for years.
And so in your previous poetry, you've talked about the importance of archiving. And you're obviously a storyteller, you're an artist, but when did you know you were? These stories talk about a young girl. When did you know you were a storyteller or an artist?
Well, I mean, I think I was doing before I knew. So in my elementary school, the library had a room where I could take my manuscripts to, and the lady in the library would like let me pick out my cover art, which was wrapping paper. And then I'd hand over, whatever manuscript I had written, and she would, staple and do whatever, and then like present back to me a finished book. This is elementary school. And I did it like 10 times. I was like, this is great. And so I was living that, and I still have them. My mother kept them all, and now I have them. And reading through them, it was very similar, the same work that I'm doing now as a 39-year-old, which is telling the story of the people who loved me. So I was living it. I didn't know that that was a thing that I could pursue. But I think I knew very early that I was the last of a line in the Damerons. And later on in my elementary school, I think this was 4th grade, we were reading The Diary of Anne Frank. And I knew that there was this young girl who was around my age that was no longer living, but I could know that she existed because of the things that she wrote. And so that became my how will people know, and it's the opening of Redwood Court, how will people know that people like us existed, particularly to be, African American, Black American, and come from a very oral history culture, because we were forbidden to learn how to write and read, right? So if we weren't documenting within an archive, how will a future people know that folks like us existed? And the idea of someone like me hundreds of years later not knowing that there were people like me in this time period haunted me. And so that became my whole project when I write. Yeah.
Were there other people that really kind of inspired you or gave you permission to embrace that? Were there writers or other artists that you really looked to as touchstones?
Yeah, I mean, again, Diary of Anne Frank.
Yeah.
And even as an adult, again, just this idea that there was a girl that felt so strongly that she needed to document whatever she was living through, right? We didn't talk about all of the politics of the conditions, but there was someone who was I'm going to document this thing. And then later it became a thing that other people could experience. That gave me permission that whatever it was I was experiencing was worthy enough for me to write down in my journal, right? That was enough for me. And then when I got leaning into the publication side and thinking of the professionalism, very early I was watching this poet Kwame Dawes in Colombia be a rock star poet in Colombia, but I never felt that I was worthy enough to introduce myself to him. But I got to watch him do it, and one of his projects that he was doing around that time was documenting Black Southern, specifically rural, communities through poetry. And that started giving me a model of what it meant to care for communities that I never really experienced in contemporary literature. And then I got to Chapel Hill and managed to meet someone who was already connected to a professional community of writers called the Carolina African American Writers Collective. who welcomed me as a 19-year-old to their professional writing circle. And I got to live while also learning the importance of what it meant to not only document, but also pursue the publishing space with that at the same time. So it was no longer just like me and my like writing in my journals. It was like me writing my journals and then taking it to the next level and like understanding that this is how we enter into the archive, right? Like by pursuing the publishing space. And so that was so special, truly for me, at such an early part of my journey, to be witness to at a table with, again, professionals, while I'm still figuring out even like what it was I wanted to write about. Yeah.
So obviously the book is called Redwood Court. It's named after your grandparents, if I remember, actually lived at Redwood Court. There's a lot of inspiration derived from your own childhood.
Yeah.
And, you know, it makes me think about place and how important it is. It's almost like a character. And, you know, you yourself grew up in South Carolina, came up here to Chapel Hill, then you went north. You went up to...
Became a Yankee.
Yeah. Temporarily.
It was a long time.
It was a long time. Went to New York City.
Yeah.
And I always loved when you were living in Harlem, you named your apartment. You named it The Perch. And it just makes me think about like how important place is. And I'm curious how you feel that has affected you as your writer. Has any one place kind of fueled your artistry more or influenced it more, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, so now kind of like on the other side of all those movements you described, looking back, hindsight 2020, whatever the phrase is, it would be Columbia, right? Like it would be the place that I grew up. When I was in Harlem, and I lived specifically in this section of Harlem called Sugar Hill, which is where a lot of the Harlem Renaissance writers lived, right? Like I was like living the dream, young black writer, like where all the black writers lived. Like you can tell me anything, right? You could not. And I started writing poems that I called my Harlem poems. My husband, if you ask him about this time, he would be like, Harlem, oh Harlem. Like that was literally like the energy. And then when I look at the poems, I'm homesick. You know, like when you read the poems in Weird Kingdom, yes, the markers of where the poems were inspired are Harlem landscapes, but then it's like drawing the South on top of that. And I would have never, if you had asked me then, I was like, no, I left the South, I'm in Harlem, you know, like, and then like AJ and I were just talking earlier today, and I think it's just like, it's like the salmon in the stream. Like it just pulls you back. And I think what New York did for me, for better or for worse, because there's such a big African diasporic culture, right? So there's so many folks from the continent that exist in New York, and they get to answer the question that Mika's seeking at the beginning of Redwood Court. They get to say, I come from this country. They get to say, I wear this flag that comes from this country. And in South Carolina, I didn't, as a young person in South Carolina, I didn't distinguish blackness from, like, that there were different types of blackness, right? Like, we were all just not white. But in New York, I was a very specific type of black, particularly a regular black, right? Or just black. And for a minute, I had a complex about that, right? For a minute, I was like, whoa, but like, where would, you know, like, it's, and then there was a very distinct moment where I was like, for me to lean into the big diasporic movement that was happening in like mid, like 2012 in New York for me, to lean across the Atlantic Ocean reaching for that country would discount generations of people on this side of the Atlantic that lived through centuries of whatever white supremacy put in front of them so that I could be here to talk about it. And so that kind of drew me back to myself of like, you know, what's on this side is like really most important to me, and like how do I stay rooted in that, knowing I will always have answers that I can't answer or questions that I can never answer because of the nature of the beast, but in search of like whatever on the other side of that again would just be like, excuse my French, shitting in the face of all the people who, you know, were dreaming of future for whoever came after them. Yeah.
So that makes me think about Redwood Court itself and how Wheezy really kind of cultivated this like community. Like it was a sanctuary in some ways, right? And so without giving too much away, it was a balm against some of the things that made life hard, right? The outside world, or the just things that happen in life, right? And Mika bore witness to that. But it also makes me wonder too, having witnessed that, and it makes me think of like Soloma Acres, like as a haven. How do you kind of cultivate that sense of a sanctuary or haven now?
Yeah. When I was growing up, I was really sad that my family didn't publicly, like my friends' parents, they were also young. My parents were also younger than my friends' parents. Educated primarily post-segregation, which I think was what distinguished how my parents acted versus other parents. And we never talked about Black stuff, right? Like it was like I had friends who'd be like, Black power this, Black power that. And my parents would be like, go to school, do well, like get your degree, right? And I was always like, but why didn't we ever really discuss that? And then looking back in my period of reflection of like what I was gifted were spaces that were entirely filled with Black people, right? Like, so we actually didn't have to discuss that, right? Like my grandparents were like, okay, yeah, we have to go out into the world and face white supremacy, but like we have this haven where we can be ourselves. And I took that for granted because I expected there to be a discourse around what they were providing for me. And, you know, like that was part of my like being in Harlem, and particularly Sugar Hill Harlem in the mid 2000s had not been yet touched by gentrification. So it was so Black. It was so Black. And like that was again another safe haven for me where I could just be who I was without a discussion about who I was, you know? And so when I think about other places and being back in Columbia, and particularly Columbia is, because of the Fort Jackson, largest training military base in the United States. And it's just a conglomeration of a lot of folks. Black folks will not say Black right now. They won't, like, I'll be in conversation with Black people at home and they'll look at me and say, people like us, you know, or people of color. And I'm watching that like shift. And so I wanted to like, so I created as best I could a space where folks could feel comfortable to be like, this is an extremely Black place, right? Like we can say Black here. We don't have to, you know, like conform to whatever the expectations are of us in this town. Also, I understand that as being a measure of survival, right? Because the economics of the South requires an exchange always. Like, it's really hard to be completely independent without having to cross those lines. But I'm really trying to get there. And so, like, Soloma Acres is like a place where, yeah, anybody can come, anybody's welcome, but also like this is a very, very, very Black centric space. Yeah.
unapologetic.
Yeah.
Right? Yep. So hearing what you hope for Saloma Acres and what you've cultivated there, what do you hope folks get from your book or collection of stories? Fiction, right? I mean, there's it's a kind of intergenerational story, right? And we saw that from the excerpt that you read, these relationships, this family, but also existing in a very real place in a very real time.
Yeah.
What do you hope folks get from it?
So when I think about the contemporary literary landscape, it very much lacks a narrative where Black folks get to exist without having to overcome some big traumatic thing collectively. And that was very important to me, right? Like, can Black people get through a fiction project without facing something super traumatic, right? So that was my first challenge. And then, you know, when I think about the Black Southern space, when we get Black Southern narratives, it's usually your known cities, right? You're New Orleans, you're Atlanta, you're Charlotte, you're Memphis, and or super rural in a fictional space. So it's a place that doesn't even exist. And, you know, and I, again, writing towards a future as a historian, when I studied history at Chapel Hill, the further back in time we went, we were actually looking at cultural artifacts, right? Like those were the primary source documents. They were the vases, they were the beaded jewelry, they were the things that people made that were meaning making for them, right? That were representative of the communities from which they came from. And I'm like, if we continue down this path, fictional landscapes or only the 4 major cities, to my point about like leaning back into the Anne Frankness of it all, like there would be narratives that don't reflect people like me or my family in the South. Yeah. And so I really yeah.
So thinking about kind of what kind of inspired you in doing this, what advice, and I know you recently spoke to like UNC students as well.
Yesterday.
I'm curious, what advice would you give to young writers who are kind of early in this journey of thinking like, oh, I'm a storyteller, I'm an artist. What advice would you give them?
So I count the day that I entered into the Carolina African American Writers Collective as like the beginning of my professional journey, right? Because it's a professional workshop space. Whether or not I deserve to be there is a whole other conversation, but I was there. And that was 20 years ago. And by like publishing standards, 20 years, 3 books, I'm behind the like where I should be. But by my standards, I stand by and like fully believe in the 3 books that exist in the world, because I was very adamant that they be what I wanted them to be, not what the publishing space wanted me to be. And so my advice would be like, think about what your what is your end goal? Do you want to be published? Like there's ways to do that really fast and dirty, and it might not be a thing that you're proud of. Or do you want to put out into the world, for me, into the archive, things that you can be proud of that might take longer because you're waiting for the perfect alchemy of people who see you, support you in what you want to do, will let you continue to do that without being kind of shaped by trends of the industry. And so that's, which is why now, like, many people call Redwood Court a novel, because that's what we had to do for the industry. And my agent was like, yeah, we just got to get you in the door. We literally just have to get you in the door, and then you can do whatever you want. And so then I enter into a space and say, well, this is actually what it is. you know, but the content of it didn't have to shape shift. We just had to like package it differently, right? So those were my compromises. That was my one compromise. I feel like there were no other compromises that I had to make for the project, because I waited until I had the right team who supported me in my vision for this project. 6 years before that, I probably might have compromised and bought into what the industry wanted. And it's hard, like, you know, it's hard. So if a young writer really wants to make big money and get published really soon, then they're, you know, sure, that's what they want. They want published. But if it's like, do you want to stand by your art? Because as soon as it's out in the world, it's no longer yours, right? Then I had to wait a little longer. Yeah.
Well, we're glad you did. And so obviously there's a lot of parallels with your own childhood and your own family. And some of them, like actual names, Wheezy, Redwood Court, are pulled directly from your childhood. What made you decide to root this in fiction rather than nonfiction or memoir or something like that?
Yeah. So I watch a lot of narrative drama, and The Crown is something that I really love. Do y'all know The Crown? Okay, we're on the same page. And so, like, frame-wise with The Crown, we know they are real people. You know, the characters they use the same names. They don't change the names. We get cultural and historic markers within that. But what makes The Crown a fiction project is that we get the interior space that the royal mail doesn't give us, right? Like that's where the imagination comes in. And so I feel like largely the Redwood Court is not unlike that, right? Real people, real time markers, real culture, real time in space. And then for me, where I don't have the answers because I can't go and ask people who have passed away or are no longer like in my life, like I fill in, to quote Tracy Chapman, this fiction in the space between. Secondly, about like memoir versus fiction, it also The Crown. And then we'll come to questions after this one. But also The Crown, like the Winston Churchill character, right? I don't actually think Winston Churchill ever himself said this. The character from The Crown, he had just had his portrait done, and the artist was like, "Here's the portrait," and Winston Churchill's like, "This is not me." He's like, "This is not me," and the artist is like, "But this is an accurate depiction of you," and Churchill's like, "No." Like, you are depicting me as an 80-something-year-old, you know, decrepit man. I was a, you know, statesman. Like, where is that? And the artist's like, "But this is accurate to who you are right now." And then the Churchill character says, "Well, I never let accuracy get in the way of the truth." And I really think, like, for me, that was super freeing when I came to the project, or continued along the project of Redwood Court, about I'm really interested and invested in a truthful story, not an accurate one. So memoir would have required me to be committed to accuracy. I'm interested in a truthful story. So,
if I may.
Yeah.
I can speak loud enough. I don't need a microphone. All of this reminds me of something that Gary Sheffield, he's a World War I historian based in the UK, and he talks about, and he's looking at, in this one monograph in particular, he's looking at officer-man relations. So, of course, you're talking about Grandpa in the Korean War. I went right there. And he said that fiction is probably one of the most incredibly invaluable sources for us as historians, because you're able to get to that, like these larger themes that don't come up in after-action reports or diaries or memoirs, you know, that are written 10, 15, 20, 50 years out later. So, yeah. So Gary Sheffield, renowned World War I historian, not a question, just an observation.
Yeah, well, and even as a student of history at Chapel Hill, my thesis, we don't have to talk about the content, but was on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in 2006. And what I ended up writing was how Palestinians portrayed themselves in Palestinian feature films, so fiction narratives, based on the history of the conflict. So they use the space of fiction to get their truths out without there being a conversation about accuracy, right? And that like completely changed my understanding of what creative writing could do about real things, and the ways in which we might approach it. So I would have at that time really had been resistant to even considering the Palestinian side, because I came super Christian, super, whatever from my family, and was presented with the opportunity to see feature films. And I was like, oh yeah, features, like this is like fiction. It's not real. And then I was like, but wait, like if I put it up against historical markers, then I got to see that they were actually telling a truthful story, right, with ways in which they could get people to consider and like come with empathy to a side. And I think that like even in memoir, like nothing extraordinary happened to me and my family. And that's generally what sells a memoir. Like if I'm not famous or like nothing extraordinary happens to me, like why are you worthy of a memoir? Right? But because if I put it in the fiction space, people are inquisitive. People want to experience a new world. And so I landed there, but thank you. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
All right, I have a question.
Yeah.
Not The Crown, but The Gilded Age.
Yeah, I also watch.
That's
cool. So we can be in discourse around that. Yes.
Yeah. My question doesn't have anything to do with it. I just had to say that.
Both and we can have both.
I would like you to talk a little bit more about the publishing process. Like, I really, I mean, in this historical moment, at the height of American fiction, talking about publishing what you want to publish about Black life without speaking deliberately or directly to the white reader.
I have a magician of an agent. That's a short story.
Is it that simple?
Yes, it is that simple. And having someone that believes in what you want to do and like will rock with you what you want to do and then like sell it, whatever it is. Yes, it is almost that simple. But like finding her or her having found me was different. Was like magic and timing and building relationships. Like I didn't do a traditional like submitting to 30 different agents and finding one that stuck. She connected with someone who had published one story, so only one story from Redwood Court exists in the world before Redwood Court existed in the world, which is unusual. And the person who match-made us really was like, y'all need to talk. And she really was like, she goes, I don't need new clients. And she didn't. She's been in the industry for 4 years. But she said something in that one story I read of yours led me to believe that I need to be on your team. And whatever it is you want to do, we'll do it. And I had another agent that didn't do that. So this is my second agent, 6 years apart. So it wasn't that it just magically happened. I mean, it did magically happen, but it wasn't that I didn't have a false start before. And because of who she was in the industry, we went out like that. And I had someone who was trusted in the industry that let me stay. Like I didn't have to change my title. Sometimes that often happens. Literally the big compromise was when the marketing team gets this project, we gotta call it a novel so that the marketing team can sell it to the people who need to see it. And then if you see on the final copy, it says fiction. So it's a temporary compromise, but like literally that was it. I mean, I know I interrupted your question initially, but like it was magic. And I don't know how else to like say that the right people found me at the right time. And I knew, having had such false starts, and I wasn't dependent on my writing or this project to pay for my life. I had a whole other life that I could say, if it doesn't happen this way, it's not going to happen. And it didn't happen for years. And then I found someone who found me that said, we want it to happen how you want it to happen. And so I pressed go and we went forward. And there were a decade between some of the first stories for this project and now with it in our hands. And not many people can wait like that because they are putting the pressure on their writing projects to pay for their lives. And I made an early decision, because I had the privilege of being around professionals when I was very young, to know that I didn't want to do that, that I had to have a whole other life. And then I had writing that supplemented and enriched it, which allowed me to be able to stand on, it's going to come out how I want it to come out, or it might not ever come out at all. Yeah, and that's how I chose my team. Like I went through, people said no to my project. Many people said no, Black people said no. And a few people said yes. And then I chose between the yeses. And it was really the people who, and one of the yeses was like, so let's talk about your novel. Yes, we're gonna call it a novel. I was like, you're not my people. Like literally in that like initial conversation, it was my first one. And I didn't know if there were gonna be other ones. And I was like, well, I can't work with them. Like this isn't a partnership. You are trying to package this into something that I'm adamantly against packaging it as. And the people I said yes to, who also said yes to me, came into that conversation like, we know you want this to be this way. And we also know there's a machine. How can we work together to make this work? Which is just a different posture. Mm-hmm. It's just a different posture. Yeah. I know you didn't get to finish answering your question.
No, I mean, I appreciate it, because I think it is magic when you get to do what you want to do in this industry, right? Without like real compromise. I think it is magic. I think that's why a lot of people don't do it, right? And I really appreciate you also acknowledging the privilege that you have to say, you know what? I can still eat, so I don't have to. Like that's really, really important.
Yeah. And even when that agent called me or wanted to call me, she was going through a friend. I was like, no, been there, done that. And my friend had to convince me to take her call because I figured she was going to come at me with more of the same. And she's like, no, like you should take the call.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What is the reasoning that you don't want it to be called a novel? So is it the span of time in which you created these individual stories that come together, or what is the rub against novel versus collection of short stories?
Yeah. So the point of views shift from throughout the space, and when we hear novel, we are coming with very strict set of expectations of what our reading experience is going to be. We're looking for our hook. We're looking for our big plot points that's going to take us from beginning to end. We're looking for a big resolution. We're looking for a big conflict that everyone needs to solve together. And none of that happens. None of that happens because what I argue is my narrative driver, separate from those big plot points, is time. Time is the narrative driver. So you open the book, separate from the opening stories everyone knows and tells. The Redwood Court section is the beginning of the book. And you're in the 1960s, a little bit before that, but like solidly in the 1960s, and then you end in 2001, right? Like that's the journey of the reader. But who's telling that journey and how we're experiencing it is for people, if they're approaching it as a novel, will feel disjointed. If people are approaching it as, even how Reese Witherspoon calls it, vignettes, right? Like there's a different expectation of the reading experience. And then just like truly dollars and cents. If I had gone at submission with this being a novel and it being a novel in the traditional sense, this same press probably would have bought it for 7 figures, and they did not buy it for 7 figures because I was insistent that it was a collection of short stories, right? So that was the trade-off, because I didn't want to enter into, for money-wise, I didn't want to enter in that agreement that it was going to be something that I like legitimately never wanted it to be.
Do you see a way to take those short stories then? Because you briefly, when we greeted each other, you're like, "Oh, I'm going to keep it going."
Yeah.
So now you can take each individual story and flesh that out more, or flesh out characters more.
So there's Easter eggs in Redwood Court. I think of Redwood Court to be the beginning of my universe building of archiving the everyday lived experiences of Southern Black folks. And at least I have already on my kind of in process 4 other projects, and wrote in Easter eggs to those 4 other projects, right? It's not necessarily a story, but like if you read the book that I hope comes next, you'll be like, oh, I know this place because it was mentioned in this story in Redwood Court. Or I know this name, this last name of this character, who is probably a cousin to someone who is mentioned in Redwood Court. So that's intentional, that like, no matter what time in the world they exist. So one is like antebellum period, one is, early 20th century, one is past the time of Redwood Court. There will exist
an intertextual dialogue.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't really speak loud. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I just opened up the book and saw this quote in the beginning. Listen, we were good, though we never believed it. And it's hitting me a certain way, especially given what you said about your experience of being in Harlem in this time of like Afrocentricity and wanting to make sure that you don't deny your Southern Black roots. Is there a connection there between this quote and that experience? Or why did you choose that quote? Maybe that's
I mean, so that quote comes from Arian will recognize it possibly. This collection of poems by Rita Dove called Thomas and Beulah. And for me, that existed the first time I experienced second time, but everyday Blackness depicted in creative writing. They happened to exist in Ohio, so that's where Rita Dove's people were from. So I see within that a model for writing about family, for writing about small town Black folks, and the listen, we were good, but we never believed it. The never believed it piece, for me, really centralizes the struggle that everyone in Redwood Court faces whenever they leave the court, right? So it's a haven of Black folks, right? It's their safe spot, and then as soon as they leave it, they encounter chances where folks are trying to tell them that they don't have enough, that they're not enough, right? That's generally when the white folks enter the scene in the book. And that was true for me, right? I wanted my family to talk about Black power this, Black power that, being proud of being Black, but we were living it. And then whenever I felt like I wasn't proud of who I was up against someone who was telling me that I was less than. Right? Not, and it wasn't my family, right? It was not my family. And so the listen, we were good. Like and that's an echo to me. Like, we were good, and I didn't believe it. I did not believe it. And so, like, the writing through this project was for me to be like, we were good. Yeah.
So through this project, you believe it.
Yeah.
Just with the saying that you didn't talk about it, it's the same for, we both are German. So our mom and dad and grandmother, they never talked about anything that happened in Germany. And they didn't feel good at all being German, you know? So it's totally a different scenario, but I can totally understand the not talking about it because they just didn't. And if I wanted to ask, they didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
So that's just sad.
And the writing of Redwood Court for me was like trying to understand, why didn't we talk about it? Right? Yeah. And like, what was it? You know, I knew my grandfather when we became really close. He was already retired. He was living a good life. You know, I got everything I wanted from him. You know, like, you know, and then I hear, like, when he died, part of the, like, remembrance of him included stories. I was like, what are y'all talking about? Like, that's not my grandfather. That was not him. And then I started thinking of the context with which he lived, right? Being a Korean War vet, or veteran in general. All of the Black men that are closest to me were vets. And what it meant to serve a country overseas, to come back and be treated like you didn't mean anything. Like, how do you process that, right? Like, it becomes this, like, this thing that then the community has to bear, and that the community embraces for better or for worse, and or they completely bury it. You know, so I, other than seeing my grandfather's Korean War, like, enlistment photos, had no knowledge or experience that he actually was a vet. And again, I got to get him when he was had processed through some of the things, but then there'd be like stories like, you see that hole in the ceiling? Your granddaddy had a gun and like just shot the ceiling, right? And like, but that was a story about an individual failure, not a systemic issue of being a Black vet in America. And so I really wanted to like provide space for that, right? That like the ways in which I feel my family and the Black community dealt with, and there's another character within the book that like is dealing with mass incarceration, which is another issue that explodes in the 90s. And it was always like that person couldn't figure their life out. Not there was a system that like ordered these steps. And so that was, I mean, those were the types of truthful stories I was interested in telling, less about the accuracy of it, because I didn't know who my grandfather was before I met him, right? By the time I was interested in thinking about that, all the people I could ask were gone. So it was really just pure, like, I knew he was a Korean War vet. And like, how do I fill in the story in between? Yeah.
To that end, I guess I could have asked this earlier today, but like, I'm wondering, like it's not a memoir, of course, and it's not like the biography of your life,
Nope.
And it's a work of fiction, but it's truth in the fiction, right? Like, a lot of times people write memoirs are particularly worried about the people who know the world that they're talking about, right? And the people that are infusing into these characters of this life, right? A lot of them no longer exist, right? So how did you sort of like carry the responsibility, I won't say the burden, but the responsibility of writing about people that don't get to read the thing that you have produced?
With extreme care.
Yeah, can you like, it's kind of like, I'm just kind of curious, like, what is that, it's caring, but like, what does that even like, what does that look like, you know?
It's really like what, like, I I think for me, it's going to history. And like, what are the real accurate things that happened? Korean War vet, like what happens to people who serve in wartime? What are the markers of that? How might they show up in a family, in a community? And then putting them up against these other characters that I created, right? Like, you know, so the story that I read, Tita, you know, tells Mika, yep, I voted, even though that's not true, right? Like, it's not true because he lost his right to vote because he went to jail for a night, right? Because he heard something that sounded like a gunshot and reacted accordingly, right? But like moving it into this space of like, that he still gets to be the grandfather to these girls. Like that was a thing. And there's another point in which something else traumatic happens to a character, and Wheezy, his wife, is confronting it, and she's like, it doesn't matter how we got here, it's what we do now, right? And I think like that, like acknowledging that like there were some things that happened, and how do we move forward, which also for me is the story of being Black in America. We can never answer how we got here. We can never answer that. And we can never answer who we were before we got here. But we can honor and continue to celebrate who we are now that we've acknowledged this loss, this forever unknown, and who we're going to be moving forward. And so that is how I attempted to handle some of the harder pieces with care, of like really situating it in the present. Like, what does it mean about who we're going to be now with what we've inherited or what experiences we've had in the now? Yeah.
Do you think the Easter egg plays into this then, where it's like, you kind of said this earlier, or someone else, where it's like it's not even the now or the past, and I haven't read the book yet, but like you get to now create a future that you get to imagine what could have been, perhaps? Is that also the kind of gift in that kind of the fiction part of it, maybe?
Yeah, and even what was, right? So like, I have one story about how my grandparents met, and it was, or not how they met, but like one story of like early dating, and my grandma was like, yeah, you know, we went out on a date and he got too fresh and I kicked him out of the car. You know, but that wasn't like how they met. And so then I got to like think about, well, how did these two people meet? You know, and I have them meet at this collard green stand in Columbia, which is a place that I knew my grandmother frequented a lot. Like that was her weekly trip to get her greens. And I was like, of course, you know, this handsome gentleman was also there. But then he gets swept away to the war, and she, you know, so then there was a separation, and then he went and searched for her and understood that she was going to be there every Saturday, and that's how they got back together. And then they went on the date, and then she kicked him out of the car, right? Like, so like, you know, so like I got to do some of that stuff about like, is it accurate? Absolutely not. I will never know. I will never know. But like, that's the story that I tell myself. Now, that's the story that I want people to think about.
It's helpful.
Yeah. Oh, y'all. Thank you.